Welcome. Before we begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? Stories like this take serious time, deep digging into old records, and careful checking of real historical data, so if you respect true stories that were almost erased, please subscribe and support this work. Today, you're about to hear a story not about loud rebellion, but about a woman whose intelligence alone made her dangerous. In 1861, being strumbled could get you punished, but being intelligent could get you destroyed. Hagar Ashford was known as a giant woman, physically powerful, capable of outworking most men, but that was not why she was feared. Hagar listened more than she spoke. She noticed patterns. She remembered numbers, faces, and lies. She understood that the system around her survived on silence and ignorance, and she refused both. Her owners called her defiant, not because she ran, but because she thought. She asked questions no enslaved woman was expected to ask. She remembered promises they hoped she would forget. When one owner failed to control her, she was sold. Then sold again. 12 times in total. Each sale was an attempt to place her under someone harsher, someone who might finally break her will. On every plantation, the same pattern followed: harder labor, harsher punishment, isolation. But Hagar never pretended to be smaller than she was. She chose her words carefully, never begging, never praising, never surrendering her mind. By her later sales, warnings followed her name: too intelligent, difficult to manage. In a world built on fear, those words were more dangerous than violence. History never recorded Hagar Ashford's final years, but one truth remains clear: her body was traded again and again, yet her mind was never owned. And that is exactly why her story nearly disappeared. In 1861, slavery in the United States stood at its most violent and unstable point. The nation was on the edge of collapse, and the system of human ownership was under threat as the Civil War approached. Slaveholders were fearful, not just of armies, but of losing control over the people they claimed as property. This fear made daily life for enslaved people even harsher than before. By this time, slavery was no longer only about forced labor, it was about absolute control. Laws allowed enslaved people to be bought, sold, punished, separated from family, or killed with little consequence. Enslaved women faced a double burden: physical exploitation and constant surveillance over their behavior, speech, and thoughts. Silence was expected. Obedience was demanded. Plantations functioned like prisons. Overseers enforced order through whips, starvation, and isolation. Any sign of resistance, running away, refusing orders, or even speaking confidently, was treated as a threat. Slaveholders believed that fear was the only tool strong enough to keep the system alive. In 1861, intelligence among enslaved people was especially feared. An enslaved person who could read situations, remember details, or question authority endangered the entire structure. Knowledge meant awareness, and awareness often led to resistance. For enslaved women, intelligence was labeled as insubordination or madness. The slave market was still active and ruthless. Enslaved individuals were sold not only for profit, but also as punishment. Being sold meant being stripped of familiarity, new rules, new violence, new uncertainty. Repeated sales were used to break strong personalities and erase identity. For enslaved women like Hagar Ashford, the system offered no protection. Strength invited harder labor. Intelligence invited cruelty. The very qualities that made survival possible were the same qualities that provoked punishment. To think was dangerous. To remember was rebellious. Slavery in 1861 was a system in decay, but that decay made it more brutal, not less. As freedom loomed on the horizon, enslavers tightened their grip, using violence, fear, and repeated sales to crush anyone who reminded them that slavery was built on lies. In a system built on forced ignorance, intelligence itself became an act of rebellion. Enslaved people were expected to obey without understanding, to follow orders without question, and to forget as quickly as possible. The moment someone showed awareness, memory, or critical thought, they were no longer seen as labor. They were seen as a threat. Intelligence did not always mean reading books or writing words. Often, it meant something far more dangerous. It meant remembering names, faces, routes, prices, and patterns. It meant noticing contradictions in orders, recognizing lies, and understanding how power moved through a plantation. For enslaved people, especially women, this kind of intelligence could not be hidden forever. Slaveholders feared intelligent enslaved people because intelligence spread. One thoughtful question could awaken others. One remembered promise could expose cruelty. One person who understood the system could quietly undermine it without ever raising a hand. This made intelligence more frightening than open defiance. For enslaved women, intelligence was treated as a moral failure. A woman who spoke clearly, reasoned carefully, or refused to appear confused challenged both racial and gender hierarchies. She was labeled disrespectful, dangerous, or unmanageable. These labels justified punishment in the eyes of enslavers. Resistance did not always look like escape or violence. Sometimes it looked like careful silence, strategic speech, or refusing to forget, remembering who you were before enslavement, or who you believed yourself to be, was itself an act of resistance. Thinking independently meant preserving a self the system was designed to erase. That is why intelligent enslaved people were often sold, isolated, or brutalized. Enslavers believed that breaking the body would eventually break the mind. But again and again, history shows the opposite. Even under extreme control, intelligence survived. In stories like Hagar Ashford's, intelligence was not just a personal trait, it was a weapon without blood, a quiet defiance that could not be chained. And for that reason, it was punished more harshly than almost anything else. The strength of enslaved women was never limited to physical endurance, yet the system treated their bodies as machines meant to break slowly. Enslaved women were expected to work the fields, carry heavy loads, cook, clean, and care for others, all while enduring violence, hunger, and constant threat. Their strength kept plantations running, but it was never acknowledged as human strength. It was exploited. Physical strength in an enslaved woman was seen as both useful and dangerous. Strong women were given the hardest labor, longer hours, and harsher punishment because enslavers believed endurance meant tolerance. But when a woman survived what was meant to destroy her, that survival itself became threatening. Beyond the body, enslaved women carried emotional and mental strength that the system could not fully control. They memorized family lineages, preserved language, passed down warnings, and protected children in ways that rarely appeared in written records. This invisible strength held communities together under constant trauma. Enslaved women were also forced to navigate violence with strategy. They learned when to speak and when silence was safer. They learned how to read moods, anticipate danger, and survive within a structure designed to erase them. This adaptability was not submission, it was survival intelligence. When an enslaved woman showed both physical power and mental clarity, she disrupted expectations. She did not fit the image of weakness that slavery depended on. Such women were labeled aggressive, unfeminine, or uncontrollable. These labels justified extreme punishment and repeated resale. Strength in enslaved women was punished because it exposed a lie at the heart of slavery, that enslaved people were naturally inferior. Every strong woman who endured, remembered, and resisted in her own way challenged that lie simply by existing. Women like Hagar Ashford were feared not because they were violent, but because they were unbroken. Their strength, physical, mental, and emotional, proved that slavery could dominate bodies, but it could never fully conquer the human will. Slaveholding society was built on the belief that enslaved people must remain uninformed in order to remain obedient. Education, formal or informal, threatened that belief at its core. An enslaved person who could think critically, remember information, or understand systems of power disrupted the illusion that slavery was natural or justified. Laws across slaveholding states made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. These laws were not created out of concern for order, but out of fear. Reading meant access to ideas beyond the plantation. Writing meant communication, planning, and record-keeping. Knowledge could travel faster than chains. Educated enslaved people were feared because they could expose lies. They understood contracts, recognized manipulation, and remembered details enslavers hoped would be forgotten. Even without books, an educated mind could interpret behavior, notice inconsistencies, and quietly undermine authority. For enslaved women, education was especially threatening. A woman who understood numbers, schedules, or rules challenged both racial domination and patriarchal control. She could no longer be dismissed as unaware or easily deceived. Her intelligence made punishment harder to justify and obedience harder to enforce. Slaveholders often described educated enslaved people as troublesome or corrupting others. This language revealed the real fear that intelligence was contagious. One thoughtful person could influence many. Awareness could spread without violence or open rebellion. As a result, educated enslaved people were isolated, sold away, or subjected to extreme discipline. Enslavers believed that removing them from familiar surroundings would weaken their influence. Repeated sales were used as a tool to silence knowledge. In cases like Hagar Ashford's, intelligence functioned like forbidden education. Even if she never held a book, her understanding of people, systems, and truth made her dangerous. And in a world where ignorance was enforced, that kind of awareness was punished without mercy. Slavery in the 19th century was not sustained by violence alone. It was upheld by carefully designed systems of power and control. Every rule, punishment, and daily routine was meant to remind enslaved people that they had no authority over their own lives. Control was constant, deliberate, and calculated. Plantations operated like tightly controlled hierarchies. At the top stood the owner, followed by overseers, drivers, and enforcers. Orders flowed downward, while fear flowed upward. Enslaved people were monitored not only for their labor, but for their tone of voice, posture, and facial expressions. Even small acts, standing too straight or speaking too clearly, could be interpreted as defiance. One of the most effective tools of control was unpredictability. Punishments were not always connected to actions. This uncertainty kept enslaved people in a state of constant anxiety, unsure of when violence might come. Fear was meant to replace thought, making obedience automatic. Another key method of control was division. Families were separated. Trust was discouraged. Enslaved people were often pitted against one another through rewards, privileges, or forced authority roles. This prevented unity and made resistance more difficult. The slave market itself was part of the control system. Being sold was not only a financial transaction, it was a psychological weapon. Sale meant loss of family, familiarity, and any sense of stability. Repeated sales were used to erase identity and break the spirit of those who refused to submit mentally. For individuals like Hagar Ashford, these systems tightened with every act of perceived independence. When violence failed to silence her intelligence, the system responded with relocation, isolation, and harsher supervision. The goal was never correction, it was domination. Power and control systems in slavery were designed to crush individuality. But paradoxically, the more complex these systems became, the more they revealed their own weakness. They existed because enslavers feared what might happen. If enslaved people were allowed to think, remember, and recognize their own humanity, one of the most cruel and calculated tools of control in slavery was resale, the repeated buying and selling of enslaved people. Unlike physical punishment, resale attacked both the body and the mind. It was a punishment designed not only to inflict immediate suffering, but to destabilize a person's sense of identity, family, and place in the world. Being sold meant leaving behind familiar faces, homes, and routines. Every new owner came with new rules, harsher expectations, and a different type of control. For someone like Hagar Ashford, who could not be easily broken through labor or fear, resale became the ultimate tool to try to dominate her spirit. 12 times she was sold. Each sale meant to isolate her and force compliance. Resale also functioned as a warning to other enslaved people. It was a visible demonstration. If you do not obey, your life can be uprooted at any moment. The unpredictability of who would buy you, how far away you would be sent, and what new horrors awaited made resale psychologically devastating. In addition, resale disrupted bonds of trust and family connections. Enslaved people were often torn from spouses, children, and friends. These separations caused deep emotional trauma, ensuring that survivors spent more energy mourning loss than organizing resistance. Owners and traders also used resale as a form of branding. By passing someone from one plantation to another, they labeled them as difficult or unmanageable. This dehumanizing reputation followed the enslaved person, making each new sale a harsher experience than the last. For the strongest and most intelligent individuals, resale was both punishment and containment. Owners believed that if they could not break a person with labor or fear, changing the environment would finally enforce obedience. Yet, for women like Hagar, it often failed to conquer what truly mattered: her mind, and her ability to resist internally. In essence, punishment through resale was more than economic. It was psychological warfare, carefully designed to erase identity, weaken resolve, and remind enslaved people that no one truly belonged to themselves. Yet even under these repeated dislocations, resilience, memory, and intelligence often survived. Resistance under slavery was not always physical or visible. For many enslaved individuals, especially women like Hagar Ashford, psychological defiance was the most powerful and most dangerous form of rebellion. It involved maintaining a sense of self, preserving intelligence, and refusing to internalize the lies imposed by enslavers. Psychological defiance began with awareness. Hagar observed her surroundings, recognized patterns of control, and understood that obedience was enforced through fear, violence, and constant surveillance. She refused to let these tactics make her doubt her own worth or capabilities. In a system built on dehumanization, simply thinking clearly and independently became a revolutionary act. Unlike open rebellion, which could be violently punished or even executed, psychological defiance was subtle. It could take the form of strategic silence, careful speech, or mental planning for survival. Enslaved individuals would often comply outwardly while retaining inner autonomy, memorizing injustices, and waiting for opportunities to assert control over their lives in ways that enslavers could not detect. This form of defiance was terrifying to owners. It could not be beaten out with whips, burned out with labor, or corrected through repeated sales. A mind that resisted could influence others subtly, through shared knowledge, warnings, and silent counsel, making one person's defiance a potential spark for collective awareness. Enslaved women faced additional layers of oppression, making psychological resistance even more critical. By holding on to their intelligence, observing carefully, and refusing to submit mentally, they preserved a form of power that physical strength alone could not achieve. It was their way of surviving in a world designed to strip away humanity. In Hagar Ashford's case, psychological defiance was intertwined with her intelligence and memory. Her refusal to be mentally dominated made her unmanageable in the eyes of her owners, leading to repeated sales and harsher punishments. Yet, despite relentless attempts to break her, her mind remained free, proving that the human spirit can resist even the cruelest systems of oppression. Psychological defiance was invisible, but its effects were profound. It was an enduring form of rebellion that outlasted chains, plantations, and the cruel intent of those who sought to crush it. In the system of slavery, gender shaped the type and intensity of brutality enslaved people experienced. Enslaved women were subjected not only to the same physical labor and punishments as men, but also to a unique form of violence tied to their gender. Their bodies were seen as both tools of labor and objects of exploitation, making their suffering deeply personal and multifaceted. Physical brutality was routine. Women were forced to carry heavy loads, work long hours in the fields, and perform exhausting domestic tasks. Beatings, whippings, and other forms of corporal punishment were used to enforce obedience and maintain control. But for women, this violence was often compounded by sexual exploitation. Enslavers used rape, coercion, and threats of assault as additional tools of dominance. Gender also influenced expectations. Women were supposed to appear submissive, quiet, and deferential at all times. Those who resisted, questioned, or demonstrated intelligence, like Hagar Ashford, were labeled as unruly or dangerous. These labels justified even harsher punishment. A strong, intelligent woman challenged the hierarchy of both race and gender, threatening the perceived natural order that enslavers claimed justified slavery. Moreover, violence against women was often psychologically calculated. Enslavers knew that breaking a woman's spirit could disrupt family structures, community bonds, and generational knowledge. By punishing women more severely, they aimed to send a message to other enslaved people. Defiance would not be tolerated, and even survival required submission. For women like Hagar, brutality was relentless. Her physical strength made her labor-intensive work more demanding, while her intelligence made her mentally threatening. Owners attempted to use both physical punishment and psychological terror to bend her will, but no matter how much brutality was inflicted, her mind and awareness remained intact, highlighting the unique courage and resilience of enslaved women. Ultimately, gender and brutality were intertwined in a system designed to dominate completely. Women endured physical exhaustion, sexualized violence, and psychological terror, all to suppress the power of their bodies, minds, and spirits. Yet their resistance, endurance, and intelligence proved that even the most calculated brutality could not erase humanity. One of the cruelest aspects of slavery was the way humans were treated as property, commodities to be bought, sold, and traded without regard for their lives, emotions, or families. This process of dehumanization stripped enslaved people of identity and reduced them to numbers, prices, and utility in the eyes of their owners and traders. In the slave markets, individuals were displayed, inspected, and appraised like livestock. Physical strength, age, and perceived obedience determined value. Mental acuity, intelligence, or resistance was seen as a liability rather than a human trait. A woman like Hagar Ashford, whose intelligence and memory challenged the control of her owners, became labeled unmanageable, a warning rather than a mark of worth. The act of trading people reinforced the notion that enslaved individuals were possessions rather than human beings. Families were torn apart without hesitation. Parents could be separated from children, siblings sold to different states, and spouses sent miles apart, all to maximize profit or to punish perceived disobedience. Each transaction served as a stark reminder that enslaved people had no agency over their own lives. Dehumanization through trade also reinforced fear and obedience. Being sold was more than economic, it was psychological warfare. It reminded enslaved people that their existence was subject to the whims of others, that loyalty, love, or personal ties meant little under the laws and social norms of slavery. Repeated resale was particularly devastating, as it not only threatened the body but also the mind, attempting to erase identity and independence. For women like Hagar, dehumanization was intensified by her intelligence and defiance. Each sale was meant to suppress her mind and break her will, yet these attempts failed. Her repeated resale highlighted a terrifying truth: for owners, intelligence and self-awareness could not be fully commodified or controlled. The dehumanization of trade is a stark reminder of the cruelty of slavery. It reduced people to property, but it also revealed the resilience of those whose spirits could not be owned. Despite every attempt to erase identity through sale, memory and fear, Hagar Ashford and countless others demonstrated that human dignity and intelligence could survive even in the harshest oppression. In the brutal system of slavery, memory itself became an act of defiance. Enslaved people were constantly pressured to forget their families, their identities, their histories, and even the injustices inflicted upon them. Remembering names, faces, promises, or the details of contracts was dangerous, yet it was also a way to preserve selfhood and resist total domination. For Hagar Ashford, memory was a weapon. She recalled the cruelty of past owners, the strategies of overseers, and the promises broken by those who sought to exploit her. By keeping these details alive in her mind, she could navigate each new plantation with caution, anticipate potential threats, and protect herself from the worst abuses. Her ability to remember made her difficult to control because she never allowed ignorance or fear to dictate her actions. Memory also served as a form of resistance against the erasure of identity. Enslavers sought to reduce individuals to numbers, labor output, or possessions, often assigning them new names and relocating them repeatedly. By remembering her own story, her family connections, and even small details of her life, Hagar maintained a private world that could not be stolen. Each recollection was a subtle rebellion against the system that demanded submission and forgetfulness. Moreover, memory allowed enslaved people to influence others. By quietly passing on knowledge about dangers, strategies for survival, or the character of owners, individuals like Hagar could protect their peers and create networks of awareness. This was intelligence in motion, a collective resilience that slavery could never fully destroy. Memory, as rebellion, was especially powerful for women who carried the histories of families and communities. Holding on to past experiences meant maintaining a sense of moral and cultural continuity. Every remembered act of resistance, every lesson passed down, became part of a larger struggle against dehumanization. In Hagar's life, her memory made her unmanageable in ways physical strength alone could not. It allowed her to survive repeated sales, to recognize patterns of abuse, and to retain her mind even when her body was subjected to relentless labor and punishment. In this sense, memory was not passive. It was a quiet, enduring form of rebellion that slavery could never fully extinguish. One of the most tragic aspects of slavery is how the stories of its victims were often never recorded or intentionally erased. The voices of enslaved people, particularly women, were rarely documented in their own words, leaving a historical record dominated by the perspective of slaveholders, traders, and outsiders. This erasure ensured that the human experiences, intelligence, resistance, and suffering of the enslaved remained invisible or misunderstood for generations. For women like Hagar Ashford, being unmanageable or too intelligent meant that even more of their stories were lost. Their defiance, cleverness, and survival strategies were often minimized or dismissed as troublesome behavior rather than recognized as acts of courage. Each time an enslaved person was sold or relocated, the trail of their life became harder to trace, further silencing them in historical accounts. The system itself was designed to erase individuality. Records often listed enslaved people as numbers or property descriptions, height, age, skills, rather than human beings with thoughts, feelings, or agency. Personal names, histories, family ties, and accomplishments were omitted. Any documentation of rebellion or intelligence was often filtered through the lens of fear and prejudice, making it appear negative or abnormal. This erasure has long-term consequences. Future generations are left with incomplete narratives, forced to reconstruct lives from fragmented records, legal documents, and scattered mentions in diaries or ledgers of owners. The bravery, resilience, and intelligence of enslaved women often go unrecognized because the system that enslaved them also erased the record of their existence as fully human. In the case of Hagar Ashford, her repeated sales and the fear she inspired made her story particularly vulnerable to disappearance. Historians must piece together fragments to understand her life, yet even these fragments reveal remarkable truths. A woman whose mind, memory, and courage resisted ownership, whose intelligence made her dangerous to those who sought control, and whose story, though nearly erased, continues to speak to us across centuries. Erased historical voices remind us that history is incomplete, not because these people lacked importance, but because oppressive systems deliberately silenced them. Recovering these voices is an act of justice, recognition, and remembrance, ensuring that courage, intelligence, and defiance under slavery are never truly forgotten. In a system designed to control every aspect of life, mental freedom was one of the few realms that slavery could never fully conquer. While enslavers could dictate labor, punish disobedience, and even separate families through sale, they could not entirely control thoughts, memory, or imagination. For individuals like Hagar Ashford, mental freedom became a form of resistance more powerful than any physical defiance. Mental freedom meant retaining a sense of self that could not be erased. Hagar's intelligence, memory, and awareness allowed her to navigate plantations and survive repeated sales without surrendering her identity. She could observe, analyze, and plan quietly in her mind, creating strategies for survival and protecting herself and others. Even when her body was subjected to relentless labor or punishment, her mind remained untouchable. This freedom also included the ability to interpret her world critically. Hagar understood the power structures around her, recognized the lies and manipulations of her owners, and refused to accept the narratives imposed upon her. By thinking independently, she resisted being fully dehumanized, preserving her dignity in a system that sought to strip her of it. For enslaved women, mental freedom was often intertwined with hope and resilience. It allowed them to remember family, cultural traditions, and personal histories. It enabled them to maintain inner strength, moral judgment, and a sense of justice, even in environments of extreme cruelty. Mental freedom was not passive. It was an active, deliberate form of rebellion. Repeated attempts to break Hagar's will through labor, brutality, isolation, or sale highlighted the threat that mental freedom posed to enslavers. They could control her body temporarily, but her mind could not be chained. Her intelligence, memory, and strategic thinking became tools of survival and subtle defiance, proving that even under oppression, the human spirit could not be fully owned. Ultimately, mental freedom is the core of Hagar Ashford's story. It is the part of her that slavery could never claim. While her body was sold 12 times, her mind remained free, untamed, and unbroken, a testament to the enduring power of awareness, memory, and self-possession in the face of unimaginable oppression.